So now I'm going to meet for the first time, although we waved in the hallway, and introduce Dr. Elliot Gall, who is an associate professor at Portland State University, otherwise known as PSU. I'm learning a lot about PSU and all the awesome things that are happening. John Fink, for example, met recently. He leads the Healthy Building Research Laboratory. Very cool. The website's in your program. And as you can see, it conducts fundamental and applied. You'll see the word applied, which is critical as a theme today, exploring the many factors that impact our exposure on air pollution within buildings. He got this award, which I'd love to hear more about the background for, the YAGLU Award, but it's obviously important. It's an international award on indoor air quality and climate, in particular apparently related to your ozone work. Nice job. And he also is a great science communicator, clearly, because he's been in the Atlantic, National Geographic, etc. And you can see his tweet handle, which I will sign up for shortly. Thank you, Elliot.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Dr. Henderson for starting the battle with the clicker here. I'll continue the battle valiantly, I'm sure. Given the title of the meeting, I thought we were doing a Rolling Stones theme here. So I titled my talk, "You Can't Always Get What You Want," meaning I wish we were not here discussing the smoke and heat stressors that we're all experiencing, especially living in the western side of the Americas here. But can buildings give us what we need? So my charge is to give an overview of indoor environments, how they're impacted by outdoor environments, and what systems are in place to modulate our exposures to heat and smoke, among other things, by virtue of how we design, build, and operate our buildings. Okay, so I'm going to try and do that in the next 20 to 25 minutes here. Okay, I'm going to start with an homage to one of my PhD advisors. My other PhD advisor is here. You'll hear from him next. But Dr. Richard Corsi started many of his talks with a sequence of mysterious numbers that others came to call the Corsi Code. Each of these numbers signifies something that I think at the end you'll see really, I think, drives home the point that we should be paying a lot of attention to our buildings. The first number is the average life expectancy of a person, living on Earth today, 79. 70 of those years we spend indoors. You've already heard this statistic. I think hearing it in a framework of years really drives the point home that the vast majority of our time is spent inside a building. 50 of those years we spend in a home. If you're a well-rested individual, 26 of those years are spent in bed. Maybe you wish you got 26 years in bed. 5 of those years spent in transit, you've already heard, which is one more than we spend outside, as you've already heard. Okay, so we are truly, wait for it, we are truly indoor creatures. Okay, 21 hours per day is spent indoors. It should come then as no surprise that there's a tremendous energy investment in our building stock as well. Around 40% of the energy we produce goes into the operation and construction of our built environments. Despite that, we are often unsatisfied with our indoor spaces. So this is statistics pre-pandemic. Pre-pandemic, we were often unsatisfied with our indoor spaces. A survey of office workers and office buildings, over 34,000 responses, over 200 buildings. A sort of standard metric in the building sciences is a question, are 80% of the occupants satisfied with some metric, in this case air quality? Only a quarter of buildings met that threshold of 80% acceptability. So we had a lot of work to do pre-pandemic and absent these climate challenges we're all here to discuss. So that begs the question, what do we want from a building? What are we looking for from a so-called healthy building? I think there's a lot of ways that you can answer that question. I'm showing one example from a group out at Harvard called the 4 Health Group, who have articulated what they call the 9 foundations of a healthy building. And so I think the simple answer to what we want from a building is we want quite a lot. Right? We are expecting a tremendous amount from our built environments. Everything from protecting us from pests to managing safety and security and so on. There's a lot of things we're asking for. Today, I'm going to focus on air quality and temperature, as will I think many speakers. I think these are acute, important climate stressors where our buildings have a tremendous impact on our exposures. So I'll talk about that in the second half of this talk after I give some perspective on the framing of the problem here how our buildings can, like the prior speaker mentioned, actually help. If we design them well and operate them well, how our buildings might help. So Dr. Henderson mentioned that the smoke in 2020 was not BC smoke, so I have my little apology here. I'm from Oregon. That was my smoke. I'm sorry. I have a similar picture, right? I mean, this was such a, stark and really, frankly, terrifying event that I'm sure many of us all lived through. This is the PSU engineering building where I work, similar to the picture you saw on a nice, pleasant day on the left, and the 2020, what I've seen called the Labor Day fires on the right. We're asking our buildings to respond to this range of conditions that spans orders of magnitudes of differences in terms of the stressors that we're asking our building to manage for us. So climate change is going to, create additional problems as we try and, use our buildings to improve our health or maintain our health. I see that, to put it real simply, 3 big challenges. First is that we must rapidly decarbonize our buildings. So in addition to all these things we're asking from our building stock, we have to rapidly draw down the greenhouse gas emissions associated with our building stock. Second, buildings are going to be expected to ameliorate exposures to heat and smoke, more so than they are now in the coming decades. And the third is that as we think about buildings as a tool for adaptation, we must be including a framework that includes susceptibility and vulnerability. So I'll talk about those 3 things in sort of the first half of my talk here. So number 1, in addition to all of this, we have a problem with our buildings in that they are a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to rapidly decarbonize our building stock. I'm citing here from a report by the International Energy Agency, though, that has some promising projections. Cleaner technologies and a broader energy transition, they project that we can cut the greenhouse gas emissions associated with our buildings by about 87% by 2050. There are 3 main strategies that they talk about being essential to doing that. Renovations that are happening more quickly that allow us to improve building envelopes, so better insulation, more airtight. A shift to new technology, they focus on heat pumps as an efficient tool for managing indoor temperatures. The third being simply phasing out less efficient versions of existing technology like air conditioning. The dashed line on this plot is sort of the expected case if our building codes are changing the way we expect them to over the coming decades. The drawdowns you see are associated with more aggressive building codes that incentivize these 3 and other technologies that can help draw down the greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. I think a major upside here is that many of the technologies identified here are the same ones that I'll mention, and I think others will talk about, that can support heat and smoke responses. So there is some overlap here. Buildings are a frontline defense. I think that was mentioned in the first talk. I want to emphasize this, that we're going to look to our buildings to ameliorate effects. We've known for a long time that climate change impacts our exposure and our health through our buildings. A consensus report from 2011 from the National Academies did a nice job outlining some of the ways that climate change was expected to affect the indoor environments. Over a decade ago, projections that are coming true now, right, very rapidly, right? Heat, wildfire, these are ways that our buildings are going to be interacting with the outdoor environment, and we need to be thinking about how to change the indoor environment to improve indoor air quality during those events. I think, again, sort of taking a positive spin here, if there is an upside, is that our buildings do enable these interventions. We'll talk about the systems in a moment. And compared to many other greenhouse gas or climate change, global scale interventions, we can implement solutions in buildings at a comparatively fast time scale. We've sort of baked in a certain amount of climate change already. It's going to take a long, long time for that to resolve itself at the atmospheric scale. But at the building scale, we actually have tools and the ability to affect change on a relatively quick time scale. Okay, looking a little bit more at these major challenges, we have increasingly frequent wildfires. Just some statistics that I think are really important to drive home what the extent of this challenge is. My stats are a little bit U.S. focused because that's where I'm doing research. But in the U.S., we have 50 million homes that are placed in a wildland-urban interface. So these are homes that are at direct risk of being damaged by a fire, in addition to the emissions from wildfire that can cause exposures to things like PM 2.5. A recent study has estimated that a quarter of PM 2.5 in the U.S. is derived from wildfires now. In the western U.S., it's up to 50%. So wildfires are a major determinant of outdoor air quality now, and that's changing on a rapid scale in the last few decades. This is not just a West Coast problem, right? Many of the fires are happening on the West Coast, but wildfire plumes transport over long distance. This is truly a continental issue. A recent study estimated that despite most fires happening in the West, most of the mortality and morbidity impacts are actually occurring on the East Coast, because that's where the population centers are in the U.S. So they're far removed from the fires, but they are feeling larger health effects than we are on the West Coast because there's more people there. The primary actor in causing these health effects is particulate matter, but I do want to note that there are both gas phase air pollutants and particle phase pollutants that are of concern and are elevated in wildfire plumes. I think we'll hear more about air pollution control in the subsequent talks. Gases and particles require distinct control methods. I think simply put, we have much better control strategies for particles, which is a good thing because, again, that's where the larger health impact is. We're going to see increased temperatures sort of at baseline and increased frequency of heat waves. Our buildings, in part because of this, are increasingly reliant on mechanical cooling, but there's a really important feedback mechanism here. We're seeing increases in outdoor temperatures that drive increased use of mechanical cooling that have changed the way we design our buildings so that they are no longer able to as effectively passively cool themselves. So essentially a reliance on air conditioning has changed building design. I'm showing here a plot from a recent study that's emphasizing that shift in temperatures and how it's affecting indoor environments. This study looked at a variety of cities. I just grabbed Denver because it's one of my favorite cities. The gray line is the probability distribution of indoor temperatures at the start of the century, so about a decade ago. The red line is what we expect to see in the middle of the century, and we have similar shading to what we saw in the previous chart in terms of comfortable, transitional, and sort of hazardous indoor temperatures. I think an important takeaway here is, buildings will lose the ability to maintain comfortable indoor temperatures without mechanical systems. This was a major takeaway of this study. And I think, echoing some of what the first presenter was talking about, we need to be thinking about how buildings are faced with the potential and almost the certainty for multiple extreme events that are going to cause sort of cascading problems. So one important example of what I think of as multiple extreme events are, buildings are part of a complex interconnected infrastructure. Heat waves don't just affect our buildings and our populations, they affect our power grid. Right? So the likelihood of a heat wave and power outage is common. It's going to happen, right? It has happened. And so I'm showing here a modeling study in Houston of indoor temperatures that are during a modeled outage during a warm portion of a summer in Houston. Right? So this is how the indoor temperature is fluctuating when there's only passive systems working to keep the building cool. This study is looking at what's called a discomfort index, which is a combination of temperature and RH. Above a discomfort index of 28 degrees, you start to see, increased likelihood of overheating and health consequences. This is again a modeling-based study, and what they were looking at is, what they classified as old construction and new construction. They generally showed new construction performed a little bit better than older construction, which fluctuated more strongly associated with the changing diurnal temperature. I think an important question we should be asking ourselves is, how do we think about this concept of passive survivability? If we're reliant on mechanical cooling systems, what happens when those mechanical cooling systems fail us, right? There's a variety of things we need to be doing to prevent that. I think one of them is considering this idea of looking at passive strategies for maintaining comfortable, healthy indoor temperatures to get through heat waves. Another example of that, to emphasize that, this is some data during the 2020 Labor Day fires in my office building. This is a green certified building, relatively high performance. During a wildfire event, as an air quality scientist, what else do you do than, turn on your instruments as a way of coping with, the disaster unfolding before your eyes? So we took some measurements and essentially found very high particulate matter, PM 2.5 levels throughout our office building. And sort of surprisingly high, right? We expected better performance from our building. And what it turned out, as we dug into this a little bit more, is our building was in a sort of an operational state to address COVID concerns. Extremely high outdoor air ventilation rates, essentially as much ventilation as we could realize. The fire comes, there's not enough time to respond and change the building, or at least in this case, there wasn't. So I've heard this anecdotally from many buildings in the area. This is not just me throwing PSU under the bus. This is, I think, a challenge that many buildings face during this time. And it's an example of how we need to be thinking about multiple extreme events, multiple criteria, and have responsive dynamic systems and people who can work to respond. And that gets to this sort of idea that we need a lot better understanding of population behaviors, susceptibility, and vulnerability. I think this is something that, as an engineer, I see missing in many engineering analyses of indoor and outdoor air quality. So I'm showing here a study that was a survey of, again, looking at Houston, Texas, and participants' response in the study to episodes of extreme heat. Participants were asked during hot weather, what do you do to protect yourself? Nearly everyone said they stay indoors and drink water, but sort of getting back to this idea of how reliant we are on mechanical cooling, nearly everyone who responded had an air conditioner. 87% of people had an air conditioner, but only 22% of the population said they would use it in response to heat. Right? So why is that? And you can probably put together why that might be. Air conditioning can be expensive, right? It requires energy. People respond the way they do in part because of how they might be limited in terms of what they can do based on their adaptive capacity. So the study also showed that participants earning less than $30,000 per year were much less likely to change their daily activities in response to heat compared to those earning much more, earning more than $75,000 per year. So income is an important predictor of your adaptive capacity, essentially. So the third point is that our framework in thinking about these problems, we have to include vulnerability, susceptibility, and adaptive capacity. We need people who can do, I'm biased here because I do exposure, I build models of energy and air pollution, so of course I'm going to say we need people who can build exposure models of energy and air pollution. We need people who can understand susceptibility and adaptive capacity, and we also need to be able to link that with health impacts and health benefits, like you saw some really great work in the first talk on. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, thinking about our buildings and what systems are in place to affect our exposure. How do buildings affect our experience? And I think you'll hear a lot more about this in specific talks and case studies throughout the day, but I have a list of some of the things that I'll just briefly run through that I think are important things to be thinking about that are features of the built environment that allow us to modulate our indoor exposures to heat and temperature. We're building buildings to be increasingly airtight. So if we think about an outdoor stressor like heat or air pollution, it must transfer across the building envelope before we can be exposed to it indoors. Building buildings airtight has a couple of benefits. We can improve energy efficiency and have the ability to better control indoor exposure to outdoor air pollution. The plot I'm showing on the right is normalized leakage as a function of the date of construction of a building. So essentially a metric of airtightness. Changing building practices and the need to drive down the energy consumption of buildings has meant we're making buildings quite a bit more airtight. You see that sort of nosedive in the airtightness of buildings. This all comes at a cost, though, a literal cost. It might be more expensive to build more airtight envelopes, but we also need to educate occupants who are living in extremely airtight buildings because an airtight shell could there are ways an airtight shell can degrade indoor air quality. One is that, similar to the idea of becoming reliant on mechanical cooling, in an airtight building we become more reliant on mechanical ventilation systems. So again, we have an opportunity, but these systems have to be designed and operated appropriately. So mechanical ventilation systems, one opportunity would be something like heat recovery ventilation in an airtight building, often specify what are called HRVs or heat recovery ventilators or ERVs, energy recovery ventilators, that essentially pre-treat outdoor ventilation air by passing it through a heat recovery core so that you recover some of the investment in changing the temperature, for example, of the air inside your building. That's the upside. Ventilation, relatively energy efficient. The downside is, again, this is a system that we become reliant upon to provide ventilation to our spaces. We need ventilation in buildings because there are indoor sources, right? We emit things into buildings by virtue of our presence. SARS-CoV-2 and the COVID pandemic has taught us that acutely. There are other important sources of air pollutants in buildings, things like materials, right? So in airtight construction, we need to be thinking about what is emitting into the space. Combustion sources are an important one. Generally speaking, combustion sources harm our health. The products of combustion are not things that we should be putting into our lungs. There are some real opportunities for public health and climate wins here, right? So I'm citing here a study that estimated the greenhouse gas emissions from gas combustion appliances, showing NOx and methane emissions are meaningful. And this study was scaling across the state of California. They also did some measurements and modeling to show that nitrogen dioxide exposures can quickly surpass national standards in the US of 100 parts per billion. That's the 1 hour standard in the US, with just a few minutes of stove usage. That was for small kitchens and airtight spaces, but we really need to be thinking about transitioning away from combustion processes that exist inside our homes, especially as we move towards more airtight building stock. Air cleaning is a huge opportunity for us to improve the quality of air inside a building. You'll hear a lot more about that in the subsequent talks, so I won't go into great detail on it. We can clean and condition air that's entering from outside before it enters the environment. We have the ability to place portable air cleaners that recirculate air inside the building. So these are systems like mechanical filters that separate out particles from air so that we don't inhale them and have our lungs serve that same purpose, right? Mechanical filters are proven effective. Studies show health improvements with use of mechanical filtration systems. I mentioned that in things like wildfires, there are elevated concentrations of gas phase pollutants that will not be removed by a mechanical filter. We have tools to address those gas phase air pollutants. The effectiveness is a little bit less clear in terms of the studies that are out there. It's a complex process of sorption to a sorbent like activated carbon. There's less clear links for health improvement. The important point is that it's very unlikely that a technique like that would cause harm, and that brings me to my next point, which is in the standpoint of air cleaning, we should be avoiding unproven technologies. My lab is involved in, I'll say, some contentious work testing these types of air cleaners that have emerged because of the pandemic. It's contentious because manufacturers of air cleaners generally don't like when you say things like what's in the bullets here about their air cleaners. So these are things like ionizers, radical generators, oxidizing air cleaners that have been very aggressively marketed primarily for COVID, but you also see a lot of language about how it's going to solve wildfire issues too, right? So emit some reactive species, it's going to chemically react with the constituents in wildfire smoke and turn them into something benign or cause them to settle out of air more quickly. The capabilities are often oversold. There's the risk of exposure to both the direct emissions from these oxidizing, radical generating air cleaners, as well as the byproducts of the chemistry that's initiated in the space. And there aren't performance standards for these types of air cleaners, though there are a few in the works. Heating and cooling is crucial, right? So another way that we can, I think, obviously impact our exposures in indoor environments is the use of mechanical cooling systems. Heat pumps, as I mentioned previously, mentioned by the International Energy Agency as a key technology for driving down the greenhouse gas emissions of buildings, have been shown to potentially cut the typical energy use of a building by about a factor of 4. The sort of very high-level reason for that is these systems are moving heat from one place to another, right? Unlike, for example, electrical resistance heating that's converting one form of energy to another, or simply moving heat around with heat pumps. Okay? These are really cool technology. They can sort of work in both directions and heat and cool a space. Obviously, the motivation for our talk here today is on cooling. The last thing that I want to mention is this, I think, big question of, how do extreme events change our spaces after the extreme event? And I'm sort of drawing on some of the active research in my lab from a project funded by the US EPA where we're studying interventions that might be used to reduce exposures to wildfire smoke. And one aspect of that is we're trying to look at how indoor surfaces might change after you think about a building steeping in a wildfire plume for days or potentially weeks, right? What does that do to all the surfaces in your home? If somebody smokes a cigarette inside your bedroom, right, you can experience that cigarette, long after the person puts out the cigarette and leaves. Okay, so there are lots of, I think, different ways that you might think about how these extreme events might change our environment. One obvious one is we saw pictures of the sort of paths of destruction that can impact buildings. That's, I think, very apparent and acute and obviously very important. There are protocols and practices that we need to remediate buildings that are directly damaged by wildfire. I think there are also protocols and practices that we need a little bit more research on to understand if a home is exposed to 300 micrograms per cubic meter of PM 2.5 for 2 weeks, is there anything we should be doing after things return to quote-unquote normal? So I'm showing here some data, preliminary data from my lab, where we've been mimicking wildfire events in my lab. Environmental health and safety has loved me lately. I keep saying, I want to make a wildfire in my lab, and I basically have just stopped saying that. And so we're mimicking wildfire conditions in a controlled chamber and looking at how a class of compounds called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons accumulates on those surfaces. And so this is after 4 days of exposure to a simulated wildfire plume, we see accumulation of this class of compounds that's persistent and known to be associated with a variety of long-term health consequences. Okay, so to wrap up, how can buildings help, right? Our goal here is to think about how we increase the climate resilience of buildings. I'd layer on that we need to be doing that while we're dramatically driving down the carbon associated, the carbon emissions associated with our building. The tools that we have available to us, I've gone through very, very briefly. I know that subsequent talks are going to dive into these topics in more details, but we have mechanical systems in the building shell. We have programs to encourage the energy efficiency of those systems. I think we have a need for automation and controls that can dynamically respond to the wide range of conditions that we're asking our buildings to respond to. I think some key needs are this vulnerability and exposure framework that I mentioned. Who's vulnerable? Why are they vulnerable? How can we intervene? What are the pinch points that are preventing, better actions or better maintenance of health? Thinking top down, I'm involved in a task force at the state of Oregon that's trying to change building codes to achieve some of these goals. It is a difficult task to change statewide building codes. There are a lot of people with a lot of opinions and a lot of interests. So how do we get multi-stakeholder buy-in to do something that, and the folks in this room might feel is very simple and straightforward, but you start to impact code at a large level, and you see some impacts there. And I think that gets to the last point, is we need a bottom-up approach too. How do we drive awareness of these issues and sort of build the public support to implement these changes that we need to protect public health in the long run. Okay, so that's all I have. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's great to come up here and share in this beautiful city. So thank you, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions. Yeah, it's a real relief knowing you're going to get a standing ovation when you start your talk. That's a great, practice. Yeah.
All right. Is that Sarah coming up?
Yeah, I've got a question that is a long past. Thank you so much, Elliot. That was wonderful. You probably anticipated this coming. Single family versus multi-unit residential. We certainly, during the heat dome, most deaths were in multi-unit residential. It's a more complex setting than single family dwellings in some ways. I'm just wondering if you can speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an easy answer because it's an issue that, we've talked about on this task force that I mentioned is, how do we have codes that, sort of address these issues at a range of building types, and also heard just, heartbreaking calls from people just sort of looking through Google for people who might help them talk with their building owner about, what my space is uncomfortable, or my space, I'm worried about air pollution in my space, what can I do? And my only thought, just sort of off the top of my head, is I think codes are a way that we can intervene on the long run to try and improve the situation. But it's not. I don't have an easy answer. Yeah, it's a difficult challenge to try and intervene in that space.
Okay, just following up on that, and then I'll let other people ask questions. I mean, the codes apply to new builds. Do you foresee the potential or the possibility to retrofit to baked-in standards for existing building stock?
Yeah, that's something we're talking about in Oregon is, applying standards to retrofits and, existing buildings, and how you both incentivize that and or require it. So, yeah, I think that's huge, right? Yeah. Thank you.
All right, don't go away. I'm going to ask you a question because we have a couple minutes. I'm going to ask everyone else a question. Have I mentioned the evaluation? Anybody? Okay. A little bit of a complicated question for 2 minutes, but I think since we're so focused on how to make a difference in the real world, I want to ask you with the idea of susceptibility. Now, I'll call vulnerability threats from the outside, high levels of heat, et cetera, and susceptibility, internal factors that make one more susceptible. In either case, and this will be maybe something to discuss throughout the day, but should we be focusing on, we'll take susceptibility, individual factors, age, et cetera, et cetera. You talked about it. Should we be focusing on that as a leverage point to get attention because it'll help in the overall mission, or things that are more globally helpful? So take, for example, building codes. Now, I was considering them more globally relevant. You could argue that they're more relevant to the susceptible, I guess, because we talked about multifamily dwellings just now, and maybe those are where the less resourced people live, and so you're maybe, by addressing building codes, actually targeting in a way. But I guess what I'm asking in a long way is, and it's kind of imponderable, but I want to hear what you have to say. Should we be focusing all our energy on broad, sweeping changes that will help everyone, including the susceptible, or focus more of our energy on things that are truly targeted to the susceptible? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, yeah. That's a great question, and I suppose I could just ponder it. I mean, I think there is a general idea that by focusing on the most vulnerable and creating good conditions for the most vulnerable and most at risk, you also sort of lift everyone up along with it. And I think that so that would be my sort of first take, is like designing buildings that resolve problems for the most vulnerable, and then building out from there. I mean, I guess does that respond to your question? Absolutely. And in part because, a lot of this is sort of delving into anecdotes. I mean, I think post wildfires in 2020, there was a boom in interest in air cleaning systems. And, you saw news stories about, how it became a feature in the sale of high-end homes in Los Angeles. In response to that, I mean, I installed a whole home HEPA filter in my house, right? As a relatively well-resourced individual. And so, I think there's sort of a divergence in adaptive capacity to the point where, the strategies that we target for the most vulnerable can certainly be adopted and used. But I think, there are resources and capacity in, well-resourced groups that, are sort of going to sort of happen. And perhaps, we need to make sure that's happening in a way that doesn't solve the problem for individuals at the expense of a dramatic increase in greenhouse gas emissions from a small subset, which inevitably will happen, but I think we need to be paying attention to that. So I guess the short answer is I'd focus on the most vulnerable populations and try and think about how we can scale that, incrementally more broadly to try and sort of alleviate the most suffering and impact.
Cool. Yeah, great. I hope we can talk more about this.
Sure.
It seems really important on a practical level. In the meantime, another mystery gift. Whoever opens it first, show me, because I'm really curious. Thank you very much.
Thank you.